Welcome to Democracy Exchange. My name is Rachel Pulfer, and I'm the Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights, Canada's leading media development organization. It's a particular honor for me to be here with you all today, moderating a discussion on a topic that is so fundamental to our future, namely representation versus racism in media and what it means for inclusive democracy. I'm delighted to introduce two truly extraordinary individuals who will be sharing their thoughts on this topic from a place of unusual insight. The first is Karyn Pugliese. I've known and worked with Karyn for over 5 years now. We started collaborating when she was the head of news at Aboriginal People's Television Network. Karyn is a multiple award-winning journalist of Algonquin and Italian descent. Back in 2016, she gave an inspiring speech at JHR's Night for Rights Gala in Toronto that laid out for me something of a roadmap to help understand this process that, for want of a better term, we've all been calling reconciliation in Canada. I hope she shares some of those insights with you today. Since leaving APTN in 2019, Karyn has completed a Nieman Fellowship year at Harvard University and taken up a tenure position as a professor of journalism at Ryerson. I have learned so much from Karyn in the time that I've worked with her, and I'm thrilled that she has agreed to be here today to share the benefit of her wisdom and insight into this critical topic with all of you. I'm also pleased to introduce a man who, after that keynote, really needs no introduction, the inimitable Siyabulela Mandela, also known by his clan name of Madiba, all the way from Johannesburg in South Africa. Siyabulela is currently the project coordinator for East Central Africa for JHR's latest project, fighting misinformation and disinformation on COVID-19. He previously was the team leader on our South Sudan project, training journalists across the world's newest country on how to cover the science and public health facts related to COVID-19 and how to keep communities safe. Critically important work in a country with 8 ventilators for 8 million people. He is also a PhD student in international relations and has a particular focus on conflict resolution. What's really exciting for me about this conversation is that I believe it will help Canadians to understand the post-colonial struggles of their country in a new light. I've asked both Siyabulela and Karyn to speak to their understanding of each country's truth and reconciliation process. They will share their thoughts on how the TRC process and the country's history have affected the development of its media. We'll talk about representation versus racism in media, who's been kept in and who has been left out of the public conversation, and as a result of the way that this history and this media has evolved. Lastly, we'll talk about what better for media could look like, some ideas of how to get from here to better, and why it is so important to get inclusive media right if we are going to build a truly inclusive democracy. Thank you for coming to this session. We only have 40 minutes, so let's make them all count. First up, if you haven't yet done this, please take a moment to fill out the pre-session survey that was emailed to you when you signed up to be a delegate. We want to understand what you take away from this session. And as you are doing that, first Karyn and then Siyabulela will each share about 3 minutes of opening remarks. We'll have about 15 minutes of moderated discussion and then get into about 10 minutes of questions from the floor. I'll aim to wrap things up before the bell, and you will be emailed a post-session survey in your delegate emails, and we would ask that you could also fill that out, as it's very important for us at JHR to understand what you took from this discussion and what was learned. Thank you. And now, Karyn, can you please kick things off by sharing your perspective on representation versus racism in media in Canada and implications for inclusive democracy? Over to you, Karyn.
I actually want to start out a little bit. I think I'm going to talk about reconciliation and truth and hope, but we'll save hope maybe for the questions, because I think we're starting out at a really rough time here. I want to thank my colleague Siyabulela for making the comparisons between Indigenous Canada and South Africa. I certainly grew up watching apartheid, watching the end of apartheid, and had a lot of hope for it. And here's one more connection you may not know. Dan David, who started APTN, had spent time over in South Africa training journalists, Black journalists, as apartheid ended. And so when he came back and started the newsroom at APTN, he was very inspired by the hope that he got from what was happening there. And I understand that you have some critique of that as well, and maybe everything didn't go as well as we hoped. That's where we are, I think, right now in Canada. things just may not be going as well as we hoped. We're all in a COVID bubble right now, and I think we all live in bubbles. We talk about living in a political bubble or in a personal bubble. I lived in an Indigenous bubble while I was at APTN for 7 years. God, 7 years. And so in that Indigenous bubble, we watched the unfolding of the TRC. And for a long time, the TRC was really focused on residential school survivors, as it should be, as was its mandate. And it spoke so much about understanding and listening. And I think Canadians knew best about the South African TRC and its mandate for forgiveness. And then what happened is in 2015, when the TRC released its report, there was a surprise twist. It did something that some people, including myself, might think is a little bit beyond its mandate. It pushed beyond and became more of a royal commission. It talked about fundamental change. It invoked UNDRIP. It talked about self-government. It talked about self-determination. It talked about fundamentally changing the way Canada functions. And that's what I heard. And that's what the Indigenous bubble heard, the people who live where I live. As it turns out, Canadians heard something different. They heard only the message about listening and forgiveness and forgot about the need for fundamental change. So here we struck off against two paths again. We end up at the end of this maybe somewhere farther apart than we were in the beginning. Do we understand what reconciliation is? I've heard a few things said. I just wanted to make sure that I got the names right, and I couldn't figure out who said this first. It was either Sandra Skid or Jesse Wente. But they talked about reconciliation being a restoration of a relationship and saying we never had a good relationship in the first place, so it seems like reconciliation is very impossible. I'm going to disagree a bit with two things in that, because I know it's a phrase that goes around Indian country a lot. I will say that it's not true that we never had a good relationship in the first place. I'm Algonquin, our people are trading people. We had a good business partnership going there for a while. We also intermarried and we loved each other. That happened. It happened so much we actually created a whole nation of people. That is really special. How often does that happen? And somewhere it just kind of all went wrong. So that's where we were. I also just disagree with that definition of reconciliation. I don't think it's about putting a relationship back in place. I think it's about taking two ideas and trying to put them together. And if you have ever heard me speak, I'll talk about there being two separate histories in Canada that create two separate understandings. And here we are with reconciliation, again, having two separate understandings. And it's come to worry me a little bit. It came to worry me in February because the level of frustration in the communities is very high. And I understand this as a journalist who's been covering things for 20 years. When I see a fishing dispute happening again out on the East Coast, and the pictures of boats being rammed are exactly the same pictures that we filed on the air 20 years ago, even after a Supreme Court decision that says that this is a right that people have to do. It's frustrating. When we see land claim after land claim being unsolved and the police being called in to arrest people again and again. In the time that I've been a reporter, there's been 3 generations of people out on the front line of these land claims watching their parents and their grandparents get arrested. And now those kids are growing up. And when I see things like I saw in February at Tyendinaga, where I saw some of the youth resisting and throwing fire at trains, it scared me. Back in 2006, 1996, we had Ipperwash and we had Gustafson Lake. And our elders at that time told us not to take up arms, not to give anybody an excuse to harm us. And so we've always brought our children out and we've always been peaceful. But I'm worried. I'm worried that I might be the last generation that you can negotiate with. That might actually be true. So we're at this fork in the road. And I think I would put a lot of pressure on media right now to do its job, because we have to start thinking about the context that these disputes are happening in. We have to start covering the real history of disputes and we have to start uniting that understanding. I'll just mention one other piece. When I was at Harvard last year, I actually took a course where we looked at truth and reconciliation commissions. And I tripped across this interesting essay, just so you know, I'm not just saying it. It was by Matt James, who's a professor at UBC. And he actually did a media analysis where he was looking through how people define reconciliation. And the media will define reconciliation as simply listening, not as the type of fundamental change that Indigenous people are looking for. The government will define it as simply listening. I'd maintain that in the environment that we're in, there's no fundamental change happening, and I'm not sure the listening's happening either. Thanks.
That's very well said, Karyn. Thank you so much for that set of insights. Lots to unpack there, and we'll get more into the role of the media and what media can and should be doing later in the discussion. Siyabulela, could you weigh in on your understanding of the truth and reconciliation process in your own country and your perspective on how effective it was as we see how South Africa has unfolded 20 years later?
Thank you, Rachel and Karyn. Well, insofar as South Africa is concerned, the South African Truth and Reconciliation process was perceived or is perceived the world over as one of the successful experiment of any post-conflict or post-colonial conflict world as we know it, and understanding the turbulent and violent colonial history of South Africa. The Mandela administration deemed it necessary to perhaps find ways in which we can unite South Africa and reconcile the country as we attempt to forge a new identity and the way forward from the shackles of this violence that the country was coming in. So therefore, oftentimes the South African TRC, its central focus was on the notion of forgiveness and providing the amnesty. But initially, the Mandela administration was actually calling for the Nuremberg trial kind of a system where the perpetrators of these injustices of the apartheid regime would be coming forward and would be tried for those kind of injustices, and many of them will be held accountable for such injustices. At the same, in the same part, the apartheid regime were calling for a kind of immunity. If South Africa is to unite, we have to find a way in which they will be provided unity. And the compromise then became what we know the world over as the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the focus was shifted away from restorative justice into providing forgiveness and followed by amnesty for the perpetrators of these injustices of the apartheid regime. One of the most difficult things which I could probably point with the TRC was the fact that it focused more on putting a spotlight on the need to bring about forgiveness and amnesty on the side of the perpetrators, and neglecting the interest and the needs of the victims of the apartheid regime. For instance, out of even the TRC itself, though it had committees such as the reparations and the rehabilitation and the human rights violation and the amnesty committee, the only focus or the only output of the TRC was the last committee, which was an amnesty which was given to the perpetrators of these injustices of the apartheid regime. And to the victims, even to this day, if you're talking about what were the failures of the TRC as we know it in South Africa, it failed in bringing about rehabilitation and it failed in bringing about reparations to the victims. Many of the victims of the apartheid regime to this day have not been compensated for such injustices. There's never been any restitution. for the injustices caused to them. Many of them lost their land under the apartheid regime, but the perpetrators are still enjoying the benefit of that kind of a violent and colonial system as we know it as apartheid. What then the Mandela administration did, which oftentimes it's one of the reasons why my generation considers the Mandela administration or Mandela, even his generations, as having sold out the struggle for a complete liberation of South Africa, was that it focused only on uniting the nation, and the negotiation process, its own in the country, focused only in bringing about the political freedom without talking about the economic freedom for the general public of South Africa. Even today, if you look at the country, we have a right to vote, but we do not have a right to participate in the economic activities of the country. The means of production of the country are still in the hands of the few. What the Mandela administration envisioned that later on in the years in the post-apartheid era or in a democratic dispensation, we're going to move over into a period where the economy will be shared equally in society. Unfortunately, 26 years since the dawn of a democratic dispensation, that kind of expectation has not materialized. The peace dividends that we were hoping for as a result of the negotiation process, as a result of the TRC, have not been realized in our world. Today, if you look at the South African political and even the economic landscape, the people that enjoy the rights of being South Africans are the white minority, who in fact were the biggest winners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in fact, one of the things that even the media itself has failed as an entity that's supposed to be setting the agenda in the public discourse, has failed to bring up issues such as the fact that during the TRC itself, one of its failures is that all the leaders of the apartheid regime refused to appear before the commission. They refused to come and be held accountable for the injustice of the apartheid regime. And the apartheid, what the TRC has done is to provide a free flow or a free land for those that have violated us under the apartheid regime, or those that committed atrocities, gross violations of human rights. In fact, recently, the last president of the apartheid regime declared in South Africa that apartheid was in fact not a crime. That is so because that particular individual was not even held accountable in the TRC. So in South Africa, then the question is, the reason in the post TRC and apartheid era, we are finding it difficult to reconcile. The reasons why we're finding it difficult to reconcile is that in the TRC itself, there's never been any reparations. Next door in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean government has been forced to provide reparations to the white minority regimes for repossessing the land which belongs to Zimbabweans. But in South Africa, the victims of the apartheid regime have never received any reparations. But the international community has challenged the Zimbabwean government to provide such. So that is the context of the TRC in South Africa. As such, the young people even argue that there will never be a reconciliation in South Africa in so long as the key issues are not addressed. That is the economy in the country. That is the redistribution of the land to all those who have lost their land. I have observed even in Canada during my visits and the work that I have done there, that often in most events, there's a recognition that we're sitting in stolen land, though they don't use the term stolen land. But the question I always have is, when are you returning the land back to their rightful owners? You know, so those are some of the issues that I would like to bring up and say, in so long as there is no clear transformation in society, there is no clear material transformation or change in our society, in so long as the majority of Black people are still staying in squalors, destitutes, and they are still in a state of poverty, there will never be reconciliation. In so long as Black people, the majority of Black people are without the land, there will never be reconciliation in South Africa. In fact, if you fly into South Africa, you are going to notice the sharp contrast between the rich and the poor, being the rich, being majority of them are white people, staying in affluent suburbs. Many of the tourists in South Africa, they come to Cape Town, they are going to see a sharp contrast. From one street, it's affluent suburb, from the other street, it's squalors in the township. That is the reality of South Africa. And unfortunately, the government, be it the Mandela administration, though it has contributed in ushering us in a democratic dispensation, and this current government, unfortunately, hasn't brought any change up to this day. Today, we are landless in our country. Even in the education system itself, we can't even be taught in our own languages. We are still using the colonial language. So that cultural violence that was practiced under the colonial system and under the apartheid is still continuing even in this day. I would never be recognized in South Africa if I was even doing my PhD in my own language. I will only be recognized if I'm doing my PhD in English, which is to me a colonial language. So those are the realities of the TRC. What it produces is nothing but a slap in the wrist to the victim, to the perpetrators of the injustices of the apartheid regime. And for us who are South Africans, we are yet expecting to receive the reparations for those injustices of the apartheid and the rehabilitation of our communities. So today, if you come to South Africa, it's becoming even more racial than it was under the apartheid regime, because the young people have gotten into a stage where they're disenchanted with the snail pace of transformation in our communities.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Siyabulela. That's very powerful and very insightful. Lots of things that sound familiar, Karyn, at least to my ears. And I'm glad that you both have brought up the question of the frustrations of the youth, a sense of anger, a sense that structural change is not moving quickly enough. Journalists for Human Rights started the Indigenous Reporters Program 7 years ago with the goal of increasing both the quality and quantity of Indigenous voices and stories in Canadian media. And a big part of the goal was to try and get to a place where we were having frank and inclusive conversations of this kind, and that people were more informed on these problems rather than the kind of facile listening, I would say, that our TRC process, the way that it's being interpreted as per the comments that you shared, Karyn. I'm wondering, Karyn, if you could relate some of these points that Siyabulela brought up to the development of media, the way that media has developed in Canada. Who's been kept in to this conversation and who's been left out? And what are the implications of that for our democracy and our ability to negotiate these incredibly difficult divides in our society?
I think one of the issues with who's left in and who's left out has long been the way that media frames these questions and where their starting point is. We've grown up with two different histories. Most of the editors who would be white male or producers who would be white male grew up in an education system where First Nations people didn't exist. We might have been taught a little bit about us during the fur trade. You might have heard about Louis Riel, and then we dropped out of history until we show up sometime in the 1960s, Expo 67, asking for some rights. So if that's your understanding, then the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to go back and realize that you're approaching the story from a point of ignorance. And I mean that in the kind way, that you simply don't know. And I think it's an obligation of people who are covering Indigenous stories to actually be aware of what the history is. I sometimes hear reporters say, Indians just want to talk about things that happened a long time ago. Very famously, and I don't mean to, it's maybe picking on somebody who has passed away, but Christy Blatchford famously wrote a book about Caledonia. And she starts out by saying, I didn't really get into the treaties or anything because I don't understand any of that. I just wanted to start from this point forward. And you cannot understand the conflict if you do not understand the history. So I think that's part one. I think the second thing is journalists too frequently allow government to frame things. This is improving. Back in the day when I started, and we're looking probably at the Krache government, whenever there was dispute, all they had to do was release chief salaries and show that some chiefs were making a lot of money, and that would change the story. Or they would say something like, education, we already give X million dollars towards education, without ever addressing the fact, or anybody really digging into the numbers to see that actually that amount is $10,000 less per child. So there's also the issue of not even having schools on reserve. I recently looked this up, and 50% of reserves do not have a K-12 program on reserve. So the children do have to leave, and some many miles away. So you have all this digging that hasn't been done into the issues. And I think where we are with reconciliation, it's important to include Indigenous people in the newsroom. I saw an article in the Hill Times back in January, just about, nobody wants to reveal the numbers, but just about every major media organization admitted that they have not hired Indigenous people, and they do not have Indigenous people or BIPOC people, for that matter, at management levels. So we've been excluded from telling the stories. That's why APTN came to be. It's because we needed a place to be able to tell our own stories. And I am very proud for being able to influence the direction that the mainstream media takes. But it's time. It's time for them to start doing the job themselves. I get very concerned in this era, with the changes that are happening in the economic structure of the business model, that APTN may not be around to play that role anymore. And we cannot let this roll back. So I think the first points are, if you look around your newsroom and you're not seeing BIPOC people, like to the right of you, to the left of you, hire some. I realize that for Indigenous people, it can be difficult because the school system that we have prevents 50% of our kids from ever graduating high school in the first place, because it's underfunded, because it's difficult for kids to leave home at the age of 14 for so many reasons. But having been a manager of a newsroom, you can find people. And if you believe that they have the experience and the insight into what's happening in their community, that's important. I've talked to several Indigenous reporters who say that issues like the 60 scoop would have never been covered if they hadn't been hired into a newsroom, because the people who worked there just simply did not understand what was happening in the community or how important it was. So there are dozens of these stories that are still not being covered because you don't have the people. And don't shut them down. That's the one thing that I hear time and time again. Indigenous people finally make it into a mainstream newsroom, and every idea they pitch gets dismissed. And when they push back on how it should be covered, they get labeled as difficult. So these are things that I think the media needs to do a self-examination of its own role in the TRC and the TRC recommendations to improve its coverage and hire more Indigenous people. One area that I've got to say I've got a lot of hope in is in universities. And I've gone to work at a university. So I'm not saying this because I went to work at a university. I went to work at a university because I could say this. I knew it was a place where they were making a great effort to put Indigenous history and knowledge of Indigenous people, not just into one course, but sprinkle it throughout the courses. And we're gonna raise a better generation of journalists because of this. So I think being part of the hand that rocks the cradle is how I'm contributing right now to this next generation of journalists. But you've got to listen to them, and you've got to hire them. You've got to bring them into the newsroom, and you've got to start at a point of telling that story that's not being spoon-fed to you by a government. You wouldn't do that with any other story. Don't be spoon-fed lines by the government.
That's wonderful, Karyn. Thank you so much. And I'm delighted to hear of the progress at universities at Ryerson. When we started the Indigenous Reporters Program, we spoke with Ryerson leadership about launching courses on Indigenous, how to cover Indigenous communities. And I understand that that is exactly that is happening, and that these courses are being this content is being integrated across the curriculum as far as I understand, and that is really wonderful to hear. That is systemic, substantive, sustainable change. Siyabulela, when it comes to media in South Africa, you referenced how you did a PhD in English, for example, because that was the language that the PhD would be accepted in. Can you describe how the history that you've sketched out earlier has shaped the development of media in South Africa, and what better from this could look like?
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think one of the most critical things to note with the South African media, insofar as South African media is concerned, is the history of our education system. I think Karyn touched base on this a little bit, which is the question of epistemic violence, which continues even in this day and age, post the colonial era, post the apartheid system in South Africa. And the fact that our young journalists are still forced for them to even be recognized, though we have media outlets in indigenous languages such as Xhosa and Zulu and other indigenous languages that are in existence, they are not given the same rating or credit as the media outlets that advance their narrative in the English language, for instance. So that's one thing that needs to change in the media landscape. There has to be a recognition, or there has to be a need where the media outlets which advances their narrative using the indigenous languages have to be given the same recognition as the other media outlets that use English. And the other issue insofar as media is concerned in South Africa is the question of ownership. And you would understand, as I tried to attempt to raise earlier on, that one of the key functions of the media is to set the agenda, which would perhaps influence the government policy and rally the public or the country towards change or addressing some of the issues that are battling, that country is battling with. But in an environment where the media is widely owned by the white minority, the people that fund most of the larger media entities in South Africa, they are predominantly white. And thus the agenda is always not one that is a progressive and an inclusive agenda. It is an agenda that is pro-white and anti-black. And that is the clearest, and that is the landscape of the South African media. So that is the challenge that we have. So what we need to have, we need to diversify the ownership of media in South Africa. If black people trying to open a media organization, it's going to collapse within 6 months. And the reasons why it collapsed, it's because it's sabotaged by these bigger corporate organizations that even refuse to fund that media organization because they understand that it's going to advance an agenda that is inclusive and an agenda that is pro-black or pro-disadvantaged communities, if I put it in that context. So that's the challenge. So, but in a deeper level, there has to be a change in the curriculum that is even taught within universities themselves. Hence, our generation, we're calling for decolonization of the curriculum, because for the longest time, we've been going through this epistemic violence where you sit in class and you're taught issues that when you go back home, you realize that you are completely removed to the material conditions in the rural areas or to your people in the township, because the education system does not speak to the material conditions that are so prevalent in the townships or so prevalent in rural areas where the majority of the country is settling. So that there has to be a change in the curriculum within the education system. And only then are we going to see a true change in how the narrative is shaped within the media space. And also the ownership will probably change over time. But so long as the indigenous languages are not given the same rating or the same respect as the English is given by the media, I don't think we are going to have any inclusive media in South Africa. So that would be my point on the question of the media and the history in South Africa in this regard.
Thank you. We've seen an outpouring of both anger and frustration, as well as an expression of support for the Black Lives Matter movement worldwide in the aftermath of the George Floyd killings in Minneapolis. It's an interesting moment. Myself at JHR, I've been approached by many leaders in Canadian media knowing that they need to change, wanting to make change, wanting to make structural change happen. They recognize that their newsrooms are too white, that the criticisms that both of you have leveled are fair, and that change needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. So I wonder if, for the benefit of those who are aware of this, whether uncomfortably or actively, and are actually primed to do something useful about it, what would be your advice to those leaders of those white-run or white-led media organizations in Canada? We're focusing primarily on Canada in this context, but also in South Africa. And maybe Karyn, if you could take that first.
Yeah. I feel like I've been pretty hard on people so far with some of my criticisms. But here's the good news. I don't care what you did yesterday. Yesterday was yesterday. It's gone. We're today and we're tomorrow. And this is a good point to do a pivot and to change things. And you can change things. You've got the power to do that. You don't have to wear the burden of 100 years of history. All you have to do is make changes today and make things better tomorrow. So that's the good news. I think that there actually is a lot of small up and coming media, a lot of independent media in Canada that's coming out. And they're noticing a gap in this coverage, and they are hiring, BIPOC people. They are moving into the spaces and covering a lot of Indigenous spaces. As a matter of fact, I was talking to Cheryl McKenzie, and for the longest time, APTN had that slogan, "We cover the stories others don't and won't." And she said, I'm rethinking that with all this new media coming in and covering our stories and doing a good job of it. So I would say, look at those examples and look at what they're doing, because they are making a difference and they are sort of leading the way right now. So you can learn a lot by looking at what places like the Discourse or the National Observer or the Narwhal or the Tyee have been doing. They've all been doing great work. I think the other thing is bring in advisors. There are so many ways that I think Indigenous journalists could step in and just help you think through your coverage and help you think through your starting point. I think also the other thing, in addition to just hiring Indigenous people, making sure Indigenous people have the prominent voice in stories. It is not, it is never a good idea to start a story about somebody where they're the third voice that you're hearing in it. Indigenous people belong at the center of Indigenous stories. Black people belong at the center of Black stories. Women belong at the center of women's stories. Your main character in your story should be the person that you're talking about and should have the voice in the story, much more so than other people who are stepping into the story to spin. So it's too often framed by non-Indigenous people, too many non-Indigenous experts quoted. So there's a lot of steps that you can take to make that coverage better. And the good news is that you can start today and you can do it tomorrow.
That's great. Madiba, what are your thoughts? And also maybe we can also expand the frame to look at the way that African stories are told internationally, which is a very rich area of discussion in JHR circles. But what would your advice be to those media leaders?
One of the key things I think needs to be transformed by the media leaders in South Africa and in Africa in general is how they shape the narrative around Black bodies in the media. And oftentimes what you see in the media about African people or Black people is often focusing on the negative things that the Black people do. The only time that the media in South Africa would go to rural areas or to the townships is when the Black people are protesting and calling against or mobilizing against government due to lack of service delivered. When there's something great that Black people are doing in the township, that Black people are doing in the rural areas, there is no media coverage on such issues. So if you look at the media coverage about Black people in South Africa and even in Africa in general, it's about issues that relate to gender-based violence, that is very critical, it's very much important, or it's issues that relates to violence, conflict, and Black people killing each other in the streets or in the townships. And there's no coverage about innovation that is being done by Black people in the townships, in the rural areas, and different parts of the African continent. So the framing of Black bodies in the media, it's one thing that needs to change. And also, the media in South Africa is predominantly white and predominantly white male. So there has to be a recognition of women voices in the South African media landscape. I think that's one thing that needs to we focus. If we are to be able to deal with issues that relates to femicide and issues that relates to gender-based violence, we need to bring a recognition and amplify the voices of Black female journalists. And I think that is one way in which we are going to be able to provide a balanced conversation on how best to address the issues of gender-based violence, either in South Africa and in Africa in general. And also insofar as dealing with the question of conflicts in the African continent and even violence, we need to bring the voices of women into the fore. What are the women saying? What are the ideas advanced by female journalists or female leaders, so to speak, within the media? I think those are some of the key issues. Besides the ownership of media itself, we need to transform the entire narrative. It needs to be inclusive and objective and not be colonial in context as we see it. Oftentimes, the media narrative in South Africa and even in Africa in general is very colonial in its own approach. And how it's so colonial, it's colonial in the sense that nothing that comes from Africa, if you look globally, would find expression in the newspapers in South Africa, not in Europe and even in Canada or even in America. Not to say we want our stories to feature in the European or Canadian or the American newspapers, but the fact that anything that features in Canada or in America, in Europe, is always about Africans killing themselves or always about violence. Nothing about innovation that comes out of Africa or the great things, innovative ideas that come out of Africa. The only time I think among other few examples is that because TRC was in recognition of forgiveness of Black people saying we are ready to forgive the injustices done by the white minority regime. That's the only time that the Africans were celebrated for producing something so innovative as to say the TRC, for instance. Other than that, I don't think there's anything that is celebrated that comes from the African continent as the South African transition and the South African TRC. And it is because of the colonial context that we are moving in. There's so much that is happening in Africa. There's so much innovation that is happening in Africa, but it does not find expression in the global media landscape. Even in our countries, it doesn't even find expression. So I think those are some of the things that we need to focus. We need to change the framing of Black bodies in the media and the framing of African narrative in the media. If we are going to bring about the true transformation of the media. If we are going to bring about inclusive media, we need
See, we may have lost Siyabulela temporarily, but he was making some excellent points there. And whilst we get the signal back from Siyabulela, I do want to flag one example of what he's talking about, which is the situation covering COVID-19 and the sort of the fascinating, perplexed narrative coming from the West around the African miracle when it comes to handling COVID-19 and responding to COVID-19. And I'll give you an example of Liberia. Liberia is a country on the west coast of West Africa that suffered a terrible experience with Ebola in 2014, 2015, and learned from it. And Ebola is a disease that is far more deadly than COVID-19. And many thousands of people died in Liberia. And so they started mass testing, randomized testing, contact tracing operations of great sophistication. As a result, Liberia, which is a country of approximately 3.5 million people, has had 1,000 cases of COVID in a scenario where the health system is in no way set up to deal with a massive influx of people who need to be intubated on ventilators. I haven't heard that story told, and I would like to hear that story told in Western media, in North American media, because there's a lot to learn from that experience that we clearly could apply right here in Ontario as we see numbers inching up to 1,000 cases a day of this deadly pandemic. So that's just one example. We have about 10 minutes left in this discussion for questions, and one question has come up from the floor already. We've been flagged that there is one of our attendees as an indie outlet, like you mentioned, Karyn, women-owned and led, and they actively reach out to BIWOC writers, and over 30% of the stories are BIWOC feminist entrepreneurs. This is Lizbeth Media, but she wanted to know what you both thought about the issue of writer pay equity in a situation where we see a pretty different set of salaries commanded by different groups in media. And so she wanted to find out what your thoughts were on writer pay equity. And maybe Karyn, that can go to you because you've been in a situation where you've been commissioning journalists and working with them and then paying them. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, at APTN, we have a flat rate. We also, I mean, one of the unique things about the Indigenous community is that women are outperforming men in education. So we also tend to have more degrees. Like we tend to graduate university, whereas men tend not to. They tend to either not graduate high school or go into the trades. So when we're hiring people, it's majority female in at APTN, and the majority of management at APTN has been female. Now, the pay goes with that, and APTN has all sorts of perks because my generation was mostly single moms. So we were all allowed to bring our children into work, which was great, and on trips, etc. Now, having said that, I don't know about the fees across the industry, but I can say that Stats Canada will tell you that despite being better educated, Indigenous women across all industries make less. And I think the figure was somewhere between, I'm going to say somewhere around between 3,000 and 7,000, because I don't have it right in front of me, but it was rather significant. So even being better educated, we make less money across all industries.
And there's a follow-up question looking at, there's been a lot of controversy, and Siyabulela, you may be aware of this, on government funding of media in Canada. How is that government funding impacting BIPOC journalists, media ownership and coverage? And Karyn, I think that's probably for you as well.
It's all gone to legacy media. There's been a very small amount that was, I think just a very small amount that went into other sort of new media, but mostly it went to support legacy media. So the idea behind it was supposed to serve underserved communities, by which they meant local, I was part of a team that intervened and said, you should probably also look at other types of underserved communities by ethnicity. And I think, Rachel, you were also involved in some of those talks as well. But it didn't. So it has not gone to support, as far as I know, like in any way it has not in any way improved the diversity of media or the diversity of ethnicity. It is only going to support legacy models doing what they've always done.
My understanding from partners is that in a number of cases, the local journalism initiative funds have been used to hire BIPOC journalists. Willow Fiddler at Globe and Mail being one example, Oscar Baker III at the Cape Breton newspaper being another. But I guess my question there is that going to be a sustained commitment to engaging those voices in a situation where currently the funding is coming from a government program?
That's a question. And also hiring one Indigenous person and at a place the size of Globe and Mail is a minimal amount of progress.
Correct. On the question of ownership and coverage, if we were to have that policy conversation again regarding government funding of media, what would be your advice based on what you've seen so far in order to ensure that the funding is truly inclusive from this point forward?
You know, I so hate the idea of government funding media. Okay, this is a Karyn thing. It's probably not a popular thing to say, but it's more the way they're doing it. The CBC has an arm's length way of being funded and has the CRTC in between itself and government. The way this program was set up doesn't have the same level of accountability in it, and that's where I sort of have a problem. I think they should have been funding innovation. Having said that, you know, there comes a time where I just wonder if there should be a legal mandate given, and this is a new thought for me, so I'm expressing it aloud for the first time, and I can't believe I'm saying it, but I think it's come to the point where maybe the government should be thinking about funding an Aboriginal network in the way that it funds CBC, and maybe funding a multicultural network or a BIPOC network in the way that it funds CBC. Maybe that drastic change is needed, where you just tear down the system and rebuild it from the roots up. You know, I often, you know, speaking of links to South Africa, I was a big fan of Biko and his talk about smashing tables. He'd say, like, we don't want to come and sit at your table. We want to smash your table, build our own, and invite you to sit at it. And maybe really, when we're talking about transforming Canada, we have to start looking at breaking apart things like the CBC and remaking it into something that's truly representative if it's not happening on its own.
Siyabulela, any thoughts on, you'd raised the question of media ownership. If you were advising a government that was looking to fund the media of today and tomorrow, what would your advice be?
For me, I don't think, I think I completely agree with Karyn. The idea of government funding the media is one that is very problematic. If we look at one of the key functions of the media is to act as a watchdog. So what you're basically going to create is a situation where you have a dog that can bark but cannot bite because the particular dog is fed by the government. I'm sorry to use the analogy of a dog, but basically in a South African context, we have one of the leading broadcast television networks, which is the South African Broadcasting Commission, that is SABC to abbreviate it, which is entirely funded by government. And one of the challenges that the country have been grappling with is the fact that that particular SABC becomes a mouthpiece of the government that is currently in power in that particular day. For instance, under the apartheid regime, the SABC was a mouthpiece for the apartheid system. And under the democratic regime, the SABC is now a mouthpiece for the current ruling party. And that kind of a situation has been challenged by many political organizations, where now this kind of a media entity has become very partisan in its own character, and even the narrative that it pushes. It gives more space for the government officials from the ruling party than it gives to the rest of other opposition leaders. So those are kind of the challenges that you are going to be faced with. And you cannot bite the hand that feeds you. That's the general dictum that we have. You cannot bite the hand that feeds you. So how do we then expect the media to be objective and inclusive if it is entirely funded by the government? How do we expect the media to effect checks and balances on the same institution, which is government, that is funding it? Obviously, that kind of checks and balances is going to be a watered down kind of checks and balances. It's not going to be the true checks and balances that we need, or the kind of a watchdog scenario that we need. So for the media to be independent, it has to operate outside of the government structures, distanced away from the government funding. And that's the only way we can be able to have the media that holds the ruling party or the government accountable for whatever issues that comes across as a result of how that government administered the country. But if that government then funds the media, we therefore are going to be in for a high jump. We're not going to have the kind of an inclusive democracy that we're looking for. We're not going to have a robust democracy where ideas are accepted, where even parliaments become a battle of ideas, where each and every party comes in and advance ideas of various kinds and allows the public to choose which ideas best fit for the current political landscape. So for me, I would advise and say, if you look at the South African experiment, how the SABC was used as a mouthpiece to advance the apartheid system in the country, and how the SABC today is used under the democratic dispensation as a mouthpiece for the current ruling party. I would say, insofar as the government funding media, that is completely a wrong turn. I would advise against that particular policy. The media has to be independent, and for it to do its work, it has to remain independent. And that's the only way we're going to have a robust and inclusive democracy, and even an objective media.
Agreed. I would love, there's a couple more comments coming from the floor, and I'm being told that we're out of time, but I'd like to maybe just take a couple of minutes just to answer the last questions. There's so much to unpack here. We haven't even gotten into the role of social media platforms and some of the issues related to that. But let's see what the comments are, and then we can wrap things up. Okay. Canadian government funds Canadian media to a huge extent. We have a $600 million media bailout that is currently being rolled out. Perhaps media funding should be part of entrepreneurship and innovation funding. I couldn't agree more to these comments from this participant. And when Karyn and I were weighing in on this question of government funding media, to your point, Siyabulela, about the problems of you can't bite the hand that feeds and not creating dependency on government money for what is supposed to be ostensibly an independent watchdog function, our feeling was, look, let's figure out a way to create an innovation ecosystem, if you like, using the jargon of Silicon Valley, but basically seed funding and stage funding for various smaller startups, and then opportunities to broker innovative partnerships, like the partnership, for example, that the Logic currently has with Postmedia, where you've got new media reaching an excellent audience, an engaged audience in new ways through an e-newsletter essentially format, then providing content to old media and creating new ways to create new audiences for old media, legacy media, if you like. Absolutely, it should be part of entrepreneurship and innovation funding. Unfortunately, they didn't see things the way that we laid them out, and so we ended up with a very different model. But my hope is that regardless, there still will be ways to fund the relationships that bring different parts of the media ecosystem together so that the new can refresh, replenish, and then eventually update the old. And there's a lot of interesting reading that can be had here. Another Neiman scholar, David Scott, wrote an excellent paper on disruption and innovation in media when he was at Harvard that I highly recommend people who are interested in this topic take a look at. Talks about the issue of culture, the culture in legacy media, and the challenges of culture in trying to create an innovative strategy for future success. And one way of getting beyond that is brokering these kinds of partnerships between legacy media and innovative new media, where, to Karyn's point earlier in the conversation, there is a genuine commitment to promoting and prioritizing BIPOC voices, Indigenous journalists in senior roles, and centering those voices and stories that are about those communities. We're talking about 29% of Canada's population if we include all BIPOC communities. That's a hefty chunk. That's more than a quarter of Canadians that currently are not properly being served by Canadian media. So clearly, in the interest of inclusive democracy, we need to get on it. But I think at this point, we are out of time. I'm seeing from the people coordinating things behind the scenes. So I would like to thank both Karyn and Siyabulela for your powerful insights today, frankly and candidly shared. They were very, very much appreciated. And in particular, thank Siyabulela for providing the international perspective and for putting Canada's experience into global post-colonial historical context. I think this is very, very interesting for Canadians to take on board as we navigate our way through this process that, for want of a better term, we're calling reconciliation at the moment. But to Karyn's point earlier, we are running out of time with this conversation. We need to start to step forward, get beyond discussions of terminology to genuine discussions of structural change. I'm hopeful that we'll see that, but to date, I am concerned that there has been a lot of facile listening as an excuse for inaction. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone listening here, and looking forward to jumping into the rest of the conference. Thanks so much.
Thank you.